Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Welcome to your Daily Detroit. It's Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020. And the world is a crazy place, but we're here to keep you company through it and maybe help make some sense of things. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Jer, our first time back together on the podcast since all the craziness from the past weekend. It has really felt like a gut punch, I gotta say. It feels like the country is being ripped apart at the seams. And, it's more staggering when you put it in perspective of this all happening in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, this is just crazy.
Yes, indeed it is, my friend. But there is some good news as Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer announced some further relaxing of the stay-at-home order, including allowing bars to partially reopen, my friend. We may be visiting the Kiesling at long last.
That is some sweet mercy, to be sure. I also speak with Detroit City Councilman James Tate about the protests in Detroit and the state of our world.
That's all coming up right now.
All right, Jer, let's talk about Governor Whitmer's latest executive order. What are the details on this reopening?
Well, Sven, it's a thing. There's a lot here, but I thought it was important. I'm going to go through as fast as I can. The governor has rescinded her safer at home order and set in motion plans for a partial reopening of all of Michigan. The state's moving as a whole to stage 4. If you remember, there was that whole thing of stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we've moved along the line here. This will allow retailers to open on June 4th and restaurants to reopen on June 8th. Restaurants will have a capacity limit of 50% of normal and have masks on in enclosed public spaces. Tables and groups will need to be kept 6 feet apart for social distancing. This is happening across the country. So if you want an idea of what that's looking like that, there's reports all over the place. Day camps for children and drive-in theaters, something that Karen Dybus will be very happy about, will be allowed to open on June 8th. And effective immediately, groups of 100 people or less will be allowed to gather outdoors with social distancing. This includes graduation parties, and that's a big point of contention. And I mean, it's a big sign to allow groups this large to get together, Sven.
Yes, it is. And, I just want to say, Jer, I don't know if the governor said anything to this effect, but Michigan and Detroit especially, I'm proud of you. You guys stepped up. I mean, in all seriousness, like we wouldn't be at this stage, like opening up if enough people didn't take this seriously and make the sacrifices that were necessary.
Absolutely. And we're still going to need to be careful out there, right? Because the virus is still a thing.
Absolutely.
But there is progress. Office work that you can't do remotely can resume. So there's going to be folks going back to office buildings. In-home services, including house cleaning, that can start again. I know there's a lot of people looking forward to that. If we're with a gym or a fitness center, they can do stuff outdoors. So think practices, training, and games. If everybody stays 6 feet apart, I think that's going to be the key of this whole thing. Wear your mask, stay 6 feet apart. Outdoor pools can also reopen with restricted capacity. And then finally, and I included this at the last moment because I have a giant stack on my back porch, bottle deposits can begin again on June 15th.
Yeah, it's a reminder, too, that I need to come up with that list of charities that are accepting bottles, deposit donations. Anyway, Jer, a few things missing from that list, I understand.
Yes, it turns out that I am not getting a haircut, Sven. I am not like you and have the ability to be as efficient and as good looking as you do with the cutters.
Bald. Bald is beautiful, my friend.
It is. So that's no barbershops, no salons, no tattoo parlors, state licensed casinos. I'll note here that actually some of the tribal casinos are open. There's actually been some hot spots out that way, I understand, according to our producer, Cheyenne.
Yeah, I'm not. It was at the Ottawa Casino, which I think is the one up in the UP. I'm personally not in any hurry to get to a casino anytime soon.
Well, I mean, let's be honest, sir. You don't go to them anyway.
That's not my bag.
No. And finally, indoor movie theaters are staying closed. So, this is the time to go check out and try a drive-in movie. I'm thinking about, even like setting up a big old screen. That would be kind of fun.
Yeah. Jerry, I was saying that, I'm proud of Michiganders and that remains true. But I feel like this reopening is also kind of like she has to do it because I think the dam is starting to break, right? Like Saturday, my family and I were going up to my brother-in-law's house to go hang out in the backyard together, which we've done a couple times now. And there was a full-on like wildcat cruise going on Woodward Avenue in the suburbs, man. It was crazy. Like it was, I mean, it was sort of fun in a way because I saw some really crazy cars. There's no question about that, but it was also really hectic. Traffic was crazy. Like I haven't experienced traffic like that in literally months. And, I saw like some big parking lots that were absolutely jam-packed with people. I did not see people wearing masks anywhere, the ones who were gathered outside to watch all the festivities and everything. I went in, I had to stop in a store, and I was the only person wearing a face mask. So a little bit of a warning sign. Maybe I'd also note that it was quite the contrast with what I had been reading and seeing of all the protests going on in, Detroit, Lansing, Grand Rapids, and other cities around the country.
I gotta say, if I had a classic car, I think I'd get like a mask that like echoes my grill. Like if I had like a Cadillac or a Ford, something like that, I think that'd be pretty sweet. All right, usually we put this at the top of the show, but with everything happening, the numbers are trending in the right direction, but we did want to touch on them. There were just 135 new cases of COVID-19 reported statewide on Monday and 25 deaths. That brings us to more than 57,500 confirmed cases and a little more than 5,500 fatalities. A number to highlight that they update weekly is the number of people recovered. That stands at just over 38,000 people. Also, I want to give a shout out to my neighbor down the street who came home the other day after more than 30 days in the hospital. She's a senior citizen, but fought COVID-19 back. It was awesome to see everyone on the block rally and make sure her place looks good for her return. So I just wanted to share that little bit of good news because it was a real battle for her.
As we recorded this show, Detroit was coming off 3 straight nights of dramatic protests, with more expected Monday night. They echo those that have taken place in cities across the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd. He was the unarmed black man who was killed in Minneapolis when a police officer knelt on his neck for more than 8 minutes. There were also demonstrations in downtown Lansing and Grand Rapids, as I mentioned. Police in Detroit made hundreds of arrests, and as in many other U.S. cities, reports suggest that daytime rallies were mostly peaceful but turned violent after dark. Mayor Mike Duggan has enacted a curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. It will remain in place indefinitely.
There were also multiple reports of journalists being pepper sprayed and even arrested by police officers while out covering the events. That was quite a sight to see online, Sven. In a video conference Monday, President Trump urged governors to crack down on the protests, lest states become overridden by them. Governor Whitmer was on the call. She called it deeply disturbing and said it showed the administration was, quote, determined to sow the seeds of hatred and division, unquote. I don't think we want to go into this super deep right here, Sven, but I mean, all of these reactions by leadership, it's just kind of crazy right now.
Joining us via Skype is Detroit City Council member James Tate, who represents the 1st District of Detroit, which is part of its northwest side. Councilmember Tate, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. You are yourself a former police officer, and you've been outspoken about the death of George Floyd, who, of course, is the black man who died in Minneapolis while a police officer was kneeling on his neck. In fact, you've said that this was clearly murder. Were you surprised, though, that this incident has sparked these protests in cities across the country, including here in Detroit?
I'm not surprised that of any type of major reaction. What surprises me is that it took this long for this type of reaction to take place. Now, I want to be clear. I was never a sworn member of the police department. I was a civilian deputy chief. And I always like to make sure that I make that separation because I give major respect to those individuals who, took the oath of office, went through the training academy, and put their lives on the line on a daily basis. I say that because I give them homage. And I also understand that with that type of responsibility, you have to make sure that you use that reasonably and you do so in a way that does not harm and injure individuals Police officers there to de-escalate. Police officers there to enforce the law. Police officers not there to antagonize or to in any way be the executioner. You're not there to judge. That's another step for others to take. It was very, very sad to see that murder take place right before our eyes. And when you see that you had 3 other individuals who could have easily got involved and intervened, I believe I read one report that indicated that at least one of the officers made at least one gesture to the officer who was kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck. Hey, maybe you need to let him up. And he just brushed it off and they let it go. Well, that's not responsible. To me, all 4 officers are culpable and bear the responsibility of Mr. Floyd's death. Not just the one who kneeled on his neck, but all 3 of them. That position is one that, again, has major authority. You have the ability to take a life. You don't take that lightly. You have to make sure that if, in fact, there is a chance where you are using lethal force, it is necessary. It is one where you have no other choice. And there were so many other things that could have been done. Even if you're saying that Mr. Floyd was resisting, which we didn't see at all. But even if you say it, that he was resisting, in 8 minutes and 46 seconds of video where a knee was to the back of his neck, you can't tell me that there was no other chance to subdue him. So I'm upset about it. And I think you've seen around the country, many folks are upset, not just at George Floyd's death. I mean, you've seen a number of different videotape incidents that have taken place that are just outrageous. And it doesn't help that this is happening in a time of pandemic, where people have felt that, other challenges have created a situation where African Americans are more disproportionately affected in terms of infection as well as death. So I think compile all of this on top of each other, it's just a powder keg. And I'm just surprised that it took as long as it has. And hopefully, we'll get beyond this stage of violent protest, because what it does is it clouds the real action that needs to be done. It clouds it all, because people are now focusing on, the demonstrations and the pictures of the flames and, the looting, which is very, very small aspect of why we're here, or what leads us, even you and I having this conversation. But led us to this conversation was a systematic abuse that has taken place for African Americans, and, racial injustice that has taken place that has really not been confronted when you look at the outcomes. Many officers have gotten off without being prosecuted, and you still see individuals weaponizing an individual's blackness, so to speak. And, we just had a situation recently with that. So I think that's the thing that surprised me, is that a long answer to your short question. I'm more surprised that it's taken this long, but, hopefully we'll use this as a moment to start to work on these issues and not allow it to be a distraction, and, it ends up flaring up again in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Let's talk a little bit about the protests that have taken place over the weekend here in the city of Detroit. 80% of arrests were reportedly against people who lived outside of the city. What does that suggest to you about these protests? And what's your sort of general impression of what's transpired here in the city over the last, 3 nights?
It's actually a combination of a couple of different thoughts. One is potentially a situation where, you have, and I've seen this in many other aspects of life, this younger generation is more in line with each other in terms of racial harmony, in terms of identifying or supporting those who have identified themselves as a different gender, and talk about those type of other issues. You're seeing that happen across the board in so many different ways that didn't happen in other generations. So that's one train of thought. You have more people joining in the quote unquote fight for equality and justice. You're going to need allies from suburban communities. You're going to need that. But then the other side, which is, I think, also clear, is that you have agitators who are using this as an opportunity to wreak havoc and create chaos and anarchy. You have individuals who have no connection whatsoever to Detroit or even this issue of social justice. And this is a chance for them, again, I go back to this, we've been in many situations in lockdown. This is a chance to get out, have some fun, and then go back home. whatever you want to on your social media pages. It's a balance. And I do think that there are some folks who live outside of the city who genuinely actually care. As a matter of fact, I know it. I've talked to some. They really just pains them as it does many others. But then I would be remiss to believe that there are not individuals who are clearly here to agitate. What better opportunity for them to do so in a situation where it's in the cloak of darkness, everyone's wearing masks, and rightfully so, and you have people who are angry, and so it's a powder keg, and everything, all of the conditions are perfect for this type of chaos that can be created.
Councilmember Tate, you also formerly worked in TV news. You were an assignment editor. We've seen images from around the country and here in Detroit of journalists who claimed that they were targeted by police, pepper spray, whatever, arrested for just doing their jobs. What's your reaction to all that? And are cops overstepping their boundaries here?
Well, I'll tell you, many of the images that I've seen as it relates to journalists being harmed were very disturbing, especially when we look at individuals who are charged to document the actions that are taking place. That is not only their job, but it's their right to be there, freedom of press. We have to see what's going on. There has to be some documentation of the actions, not just of the protesters and demonstrators, but also of the law enforcement. And when you see a reporter being arrested live, which is ridiculous. You see that happening live, you have to question the actions. When you see reporters live being pelted by these rubber bullets, you have to question that situation. When you see reporters who are laid out on the ground and are sprayed with pepper spray in their face or shoved and pushed, there's a clear delineation between someone who's causing trouble and someone who's doing their job. And I know that many reporters were not or have not been wearing any identifying, logos on their mic flags to indicate who they're from. That's not what this is about. Some of them certainly have credentials, and you can tell when someone has a huge camera, not a cell phone, but a camera and a cameraman and a crew with them. Some of them are even having security. And I think what we're seeing with some officers, and I've got to say some because the great majority of law enforcement, I'll put everything I have on the line when I say this, the great majority of law enforcement officers around this country, certainly in the city of Detroit, are commendable. They do their job and they want to go home. They visit their family and be with their families just like everyone else does. But then you have this group who are ultra aggressive, and they, maybe in the same sense, they want to get home as well by any means necessary, but they don't recognize that there is limits to this authority that they have, and that limit is based upon people's rights. And when you violate someone's right, you've crossed over. And so I think it's imperative that every police department, every report that is submitted has to be reviewed, investigated, and appropriate action has to be taken to ensure that this doesn't happen. Because what we're seeing, again, is a situation that, really points to a lot of the acts that the community have talked about over the years. If you're willing to do that with a journalist who has clear methods of documenting the actions right there on live television, if you're still willing to take those same actions, the question is, what type of actions are you taking when people are not watching?
Do you think the news media is missing anything about these protests and why, this has exploded in the way that it has?
I think everybody's kind of learning this thing all together. I think one challenge you have to always not do is lose sight of why people are out there in the first place. And I'm not just talking about the agitators who want to just create chaos and anarchy. I'm talking about those individuals who are truly pained and hurt and are trying to make sure that there's some real meaningful change that takes place within our country. I think that's the piece that we cannot lose in terms for journalists. You cannot solely get focused on the images. Those are very important because that helps tell the story of this moment. But we have to also put it in context as to why we find ourselves in this situation.
Finally, Councilmember Tate, the governor today talked about taking more steps to reopen the state's economy. Your thoughts on how that will affect District 1 and how that's going to be received and what it means for business owners out there?
I certainly know that a number of business owners who are absolutely ready to open up the economy for the district. Of course, again, still being in the midst of the pandemic, it's not over with yet. that brings an additional challenge, whether we're talking about keeping people safe physically, but making sure that financially you're able to absorb the additional costs for keeping people safe. So there's still some concern from many of those business owners, even the ones that want to open, but you got to realize that this is their livelihood. And there are some safety nets that are available to them, but it certainly isn't to the point where it allows them to sustain themselves over the number of months that we found ourselves in quarantine and stay at home. So I think it's very responsible. I think the way that the governor has approached this matter thus far has been, I believe, right on point, because we should not rush it. There should be phases of reopening, but I think time will tell on if it's still too early to open up. I mean, I think we also have to keep in perspective with a lot of these areas of civil unrest around the country. You saw people without masks. You saw this close person-to-person contact, yelling and screaming. And we often talk about these droplets that are so very important. We know there are a lot of droplets that were being, fumed out there in the area, and everyone goes home. Everyone goes back, whether you live in that particular municipality, where the activities were taking place or not. But, the question is, will these activities that took place increase the infection rate around this country? I hope that doesn't take place. But based upon, all that we've heard thus far, it would be counterintuitive if it didn't happen. And I think, last that I've read, it takes maybe about a week or so before we start seeing the symptoms showing up. So a lot of this is still very, very, very fluid. In my opinion, if we don't have a swift arrest and charging of all 4 officers, I see this continuing for even longer, with civil unrest taking place. And so it's going to challenge businesses in the long term in reopening. The longer and longer the police department and prosecutor waits to arrest and charge these individuals, I think people are only going to get even more angry, and it's going to be an even more challenging situation. So here in Michigan, I'm just, thankful that we haven't had, at least in Detroit, we haven't had the types of activity we've seen, the really terrible activity we've seen in terms of damaged businesses outside of Detroit and other places. But, I think we're all waiting to see what the results would be as we move forward. It's clear we've got to make a change in what's going on, whether we talk about socially, whether we talk about the economics, about the politics of how we operate. There's got to be some change. And, I think that message is being heard very loudly around this country.
James Tate is a member of the Detroit City Council. He represents District 1. Councilmember Tate, thanks so much for your time today.
No, I thank you guys for having me. I'll come back anytime.
All right, really quick, wanted to run down a couple of business closures and also one opening.
First, the Detroit Institute of Music Education, otherwise known as DIME, that closed Monday. Word has been circulating among students that the 100-plus student school in downtown Detroit won't be returning in the fall. It's in a really cool building there on Griswold, right near Capitol Park. It's a shame to see this go. It had a cool little music venue downstairs. Opened in 2014, the for-profit college offered multi-year programs and frequently had students work with artists that hit the Billboard charts. And I know a few people connected to it, and, it was pricey, but it seemed that there were some people who got a lot of benefit out of it.
Yeah, sorry to hear it go. It's not a happy thing. Secondly, the New Order coffee shop location in Brush Park on Woodward, just south of Mac, has closed permanently. That shop had opened in 2017. New Order will have its flagship location going forward in Royal Oak at Woodward Corners. That's the development at 13 in Woodward outside of Beaumont Hospital.
And finally, an opening. Vegan restaurant Street Beat will be serving customers starting today. That's Tuesday, with curbside pickup out of the 3rd Street bar location. That starts at 3 p.m. We'll put a link in the show notes. You will need to order online to get your fake chicken nuggets or fake chicken parmy. Their names for their dishes, not ours. Personally, I eat everything. I gotta admit, I like their fake chicken nuggets, man.
I'll have to try them. All right, that's going to do it for today's show. Hang on to your hats, friends. We are on a wild ride these days in these here United States of America. I'm Sven Gustafson.
Yep. Before we let you go, wanted to quickly mention that we're brought to you by our members, and your support is greatly appreciated in these times. You can join those cool folks at patreon.com/dailydetroit. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and somehow we'll get through this together.